Hi.
Hello. Hi.
I'm Stephen, and I'm a fishing addict.
Hello, Stephen.
For about 15 years, I was a contributor to the Outdoors column of the New York Times. I edited a book in 2007 called Upriver and Downstream. In 2016, I wrote a book called Fish On, Fish Off. And now I've written a book called The Cast in the Woods. I'm not proud of these things. I just want you guys to know where I'm coming from. My addiction began early in life. It started out with bluegills, kind of a gateway fish. Went on to things like largemouth bass, catfish, then saltwater fish, stripers, bluefish. Again, I'm not proud, just where I'm coming from. Then in the early 1990s, my addiction hit a whole new level when, for the first time, I caught a wild trout on my fly rod in the Catskills. I remember the day like it happened half an hour ago. I remember the way the trout was rising. I remember the overhanging branch where the trout was holding. I remember the mayflies trickling off the river and the trout coming up and taking them one at a time. And I remember how I made that final cast and how the line unfurled and then the leader and the fly touched down just ahead of the fish and it drifted over the trout and the trout came up and ate it and I set the hook. And the trout went absolutely batshit. It ran and it jumped and it ran and it jumped and I was trying to land and it ran and it jumped and started and it broke the line. And I stood there in the river like this. And I said to myself, I will travel to the gates of hell and catch that fish. And so for the next 10 years, that's pretty much what I did. I drove back and forth to the Catskill Mountains, back and forth, 3 hours one way, back and forth, trying to catch that trout. And I'd go camping at night, or I'd sleep in my car, or I'd spring for a cheap motel. But it wasn't sustainable. So I came up with an idea. I will buy a cabin, a fishing cabin. Fish more, drive less. Fish whenever the hell I feel like it. And so I began looking, and about 2 years later, I found the place. It was a vintage cabin built in the 1940s, sitting on 14 acres of beautiful wood, something out of Lord of the Rings, and it came with its own quarter-mile stretch of wild trout stream, full of native brook trout and wild rainbow trout. And I was a short drive away from a dozen blue ribbon trout rivers. So this spot, this cabin, these woods, this stream, these rivers would be, if you will, my crack den to pursue my addiction. But as it turns out, it's not that easy to maintain a simple cabin in the woods and 14 and a quarter mile of trout stream. It's not that simple. First came the floods. There were 3 in 3 years. First there was a 100-year flood. There was a 500-year flood, and then there was a 700-year flood. That's 1,300 years of floods in 3 years. How they calculate that, I have no idea. The 700-year flood was the real bad one. They say between 15 and 17 inches of rain fell in 36 hours in a narrow watershed. Homes were washed away, bridges washed away, roads buckled. I couldn't get to my cabin for about a week. And when I finally got there, I drove up and I said, the cabin looks fine. The cabin sits on a high bluff. It's right on this little stream, but it's on a high bluff. But my stream, my beautiful trout stream, that was lined with shade trees and ferns and had frogs and toads and crayfish in it, looked like a moonscape. It looked like the Los Angeles River. The Los Angeles River looked nicer than my trout stream. All the trees were gone. All the beautiful clear trout pools had filled in. The deepest pool in the stream was about an inch deep. Fish were gone, crayfish were gone, everything was gone. So I sat there and I stared at the stream for a long time, and I thought to myself, well, I could either tell my grandkids someday that, hey, you see that drainage ditch in front of Gramps' cabin? There used to be trout in there. Or I can learn how to fix a trout stream. And so that's what I did. And I began reading books, and I learned that to fix a trout stream, it takes three things. It takes time, sweat, and Advil, or the painkiller of your choice. And it takes trees too. So I learned that New York State has something called the seedling program, where you can buy seedlings in bulk for cheap. And so when I found out about this program, I pretty much went nuts. And those first 2 years, I planted about 700 seedlings along my stream. And it's important to point out that after the flood, there was no more soil. So this was like planting trees in like a rock quarry. So each one of the trees was kind of an ordeal. But I did get them in the ground. And then after that, every time I would drive up, I would run down, and every time I drive up to my cabin, I would run down and look at the stream and look at the trees, and the trees became like the surrogates for trout. I'd walk along and I'd go, oh, look, the willows grew an inch, and oh, the pines are coming in, and the dogwoods are flowering, and that's the way it was for about 2 years. And then also, slowly over time, the stream began to engineer itself. Every time there'd be a high water, a little pool would form, and I began to see the tops of boulders. And so then one day, and this was almost 2 years after the flood, I'd been eyeballing this one pool that was just looking really good. It was looking dark and mysterious, and I thought to myself, And so I walked onto my porch. I took my little 1 ounce, 2-weight fly rod, a fly rod just meant for that stream. I hadn't made a cast with that rod in 2 years. I blew the dust off of it. And I walked up to that pool, and I made a cast, and the fly landed on the pool. And a trout came up and ate the fly. Oh my God! And I landed a 6-inch native brook trout. And if I could have hugged it, I would have. But I didn't hug it, I let it go. And I almost started crying. And it was like a miracle. It's like the trout came back, I can't believe it. But the more I learned about it, it wasn't a miracle. I mean, trout have been in the Catskills for 14,000 years, since the Wisconsin Glacier receded. And I thought about it, and over that time, I'm sure there may have been a 5,000-year flood, or maybe even a 10,000-year flood, and the trout are still here. So I learned that nature can come back if you give it a chance. And all I did was help it along a little bit. But then I also learned that, and I started thinking about it. I said, okay, put some trees in the ground, and I realized that trout need trees, okay? Trees shade the stream, keep it cool, and provide cover, roots and that sort of thing for trout. And then trees, in turn, need birds to drop seeds and grow more trees. And then also to eat pest insects. And then also, trees need black bears because deer love to browse on seedlings. So if you want trees to grow, you need black bears to keep the deer in check. So now it all of a sudden became all very complicated. Up until that point, I thought a trout stream is water, trout, and some mayflies. And now I realize a trout stream is Blackburnian warblers and black bears and wood frogs and American toads and spring salamanders and all that stuff. And so I began to realize that if I want to fish in this stream whenever the hell I want to, and I want to protect it, well, now I have to be a steward of these 14 acres. I have to think about everything from the thrushes and vireos to the trout and mayflies. And I was like, cool, I'll do that. I'm the steward of 14 acres. Pretty cool. And right around then is when I learned about fracking coming to the Catskills. And I did more research, and I learned about things like toxic fracking fluids, radioactive fracking waste, air pollution, light pollution, noise pollution, forest fragmentation, thousands of trucks rumbling down little dirt roads, waves of humanity descending on this quiet landscape. And I thought to myself, well, I want to fish whenever the hell I want, so that's the reason I'm here. So I have no interest in fracking. And meanwhile, I'm being offered these leases. Hey, sign here. We want to explore for energy on your land. No. And it was enough to pay off my cabin. And each one of those got thrown in the garbage. And I had no interest in it. And right around then is when I found out one of the first of 6 wells to be sited in all of New York State was about 3 minutes from the front porch of my cabin. It turned out a lot of my neighbors had signed leases. And not only was that well to be 3 minutes from my cabin, I was going to be included in something called a spacing unit because enough of my neighbors had signed. Basically, they say, here's the well. They draw a 1 square mile block around it, and they say, we will be drilling under all of this property, whether you signed a lease or not. That included my own. So they would be drilling underneath my cabin. It's like eminent domain. And so again, because now I am the representative of tanagers and all the rest of them, I decided to become an activist. And so I went to public hearings, and I wrote letters, and I testified at public hearings, and I went to Albany, and I met with elected officials, and I wrote more letters, and I testified some more. And as you all know, in 2014, after a long battle, fracking was banned in New York State, and we celebrated that. But it'll never be over. I know that. As long as the gas companies think that there is gas in them thar hills, it will always sort of loom. But I will be there waiting for them. But the book is not just about fracking and floods. For example, there's a very beautiful chapter about my outhouse. And in fact, the name of the chapter is My Beautiful Outhouse. And I have to say, our cabin has a fully functioning bathroom and running water and all that stuff. I just happen to think outhouses are cool. So I wanted to build an outhouse. And I get into great detail about why I did that. And I also thought in this whole stewardship thing, maybe I'll tread a little lighter on the landscape. So I didn't just build any old outhouse. I built a moldering privy, and I'm so delighted to tell you today what that is. A regular outhouse is a pit, and there's the outhouse sitting over the pit. A moldering privy sits on a cribbing, and it's above the ground. And in that cribbing are 1,000 red wiggler composting worms that do, we'll call it God's work. And then when you're done, you throw in a handful of soil, which contains other natural composters, and they all do their thing. And it's amazing how it works. I mean, it really does work very well. And I swear this is true. There is no smell in a moldering privy, a well-functioning moldering privy. And then, because we're all friends here, let's face it. I mean, what's better than walking up into the woods, opening the door, staring out over the hemlocks, doing a little birding, thinking about life, feeding the worms, you know, the whole thing. What's better? There is nothing better than that. I mean, the answer is nothing. Am I right? So I would talk on and on about outhouses anytime, any place, just name it. So back to fishing. So in between chapters, there's like a journal entry about fishing. And the reason I did that, not just to like break the chapters up, was because fishing's what always like saved me in this ordeal. Whenever fracking looked like it was going to happen the next day, it seemed like I'd catch like a 20-inch brown trout somewhere, and I'd go, oh, look at this trout. Fracking, schmacking. Oh. And then when I look and I go, oh my God, I've got to plant 300 more trees. I'd catch a beautiful rainbow trout, and I go, okay, we'll plant the trees. It's okay. It's going to be okay. And whether I was fighting mice, which I get into in the book, ticks, knotweed, whatever, I'd catch a brook trout, and I'd be like, hey, it's all part of the deal. So fishing is what kind of saved me, and what sort of, you know, that's the whole reason I was up there, and the whole addiction thing. And so, having been to my share of authors' talks, this is the point where the author reads some poignant passage from the book and sums things up. I am not going to do that. What I will do, I've decided I created a kind of a mashup of select passages, and I'm going to read parts of those. So, okay. Drink some more vodka. There we go. Here was the North American version of the Amazon, these great eastern woods. And our cabin, high above a trout stream, would be our own version of a floating house to observe nature humming along in fifth gear. I took in another deep breath and uttered these fateful words. It's perfect. The biggest, smallest stream. All told, the stream is about 3 miles long. It originates from a wet meadow lying in a saddle between two mountains. I hiked there once with my neighbor Tim. We made our way up a series of old hunting trails and eventually crossed into a tract of state-owned forest that Tim said hadn't been logged in perhaps a century. And it showed. As soon as we entered the state land, trees seemed to double in size. There were black cherries, choice lumber around here, more than 3 feet across. Tim showed me a truly giant hemlock that looked as big as a redwood. I took a picture of it and later sent it to a friend who was a state forester. He speculated it could be as much as 700 years old. Beyond the trees, we could see the meadow, 4 or 5 acres of tall grasses ringed by more forest land. It looked like it once was a beaver pond that had shallowed out over time. I walked to the edge and could hear the gentle purl of water running from somewhere beneath the grass. Floods and dam floods. Then I looked downstream and could see where many of the trees had wound up. A log jam bigger than my cabin lodged against what was left of the culvert. I looked back at the stream. The shade trees were gone. The trout pools were gone. Presumably the trout were gone, and the bugs were gone. Gone, gone, gone. I stood silently for another minute. A wood pewee called cheerfully, "Pee-wee! Shut the hell up." Build it and they will rise. The next several hours might best be imagined as a movie montage. Song of the Volga boatman plays. There is sweat and toil. Hundreds and hundreds of seedlings are unbagged and placed in buckets of water. I'm surprised how small some of them are, barely 6 inches tall. Others are longer but resemble leafless buggy whips. I imagine the years it will take for these to grow in. Then planting bars are wielded mightily. They ricochet off rocks, sometimes literally sending up sparks. But occasionally they strike pay dirt in the form of rare as gold pockets of good soil. Meanwhile, entire dance troupes of black flies have entered the scene, pirouetting around our heads. Jim repeatedly plays the old camper's trick of standing next to me, then pretending to tie his shoe and backing away hunched over, thus transferring his black fly squadron to my own sweaty noggin. The joys of fishing and fracking. A landman representing one of the gas companies proved to be particularly relentless. He left messages on our home phone several times that we always ignored. He sent multiple ready-to-sign leases, which we promptly tossed into the recycling bin. One day, we had just returned to New Jersey from upstate, and a neighbor told us someone had stopped by looking for us. He left a card, and I immediately recognized the name, so I decided to finally call him. When I got him on the phone, he said that he happened to be in the neighborhood and decided to drop by. Then he laughed and admitted his office was currently in the town near my cabin, 125 miles away. I could tell I had a true salesman on the line, the kind who would have you driving away in a brand new car when all you wanted was an oil change. But my armor was well fastened that day. The conversation went like this. So, did you have a chance to look at our offer? Yes. Well, what did you think? I'm not interested. It's a generous offer. I'm not interested. Is there some sort of environmental concern? Not interested. Are there any other concerns? What I wanted to say was this. Speaking on behalf of the brook trout, rainbows, mayflies, stoneflies, salamanders, frogs, toads, peepers, newts, and assorted thrushes, warblers, and flycatchers currently under my stewardship, I am declining your offer. But instead, I said once again, not interested. The bird hatch. I consider myself extremely fortunate that the birders I learned from were not the Tweety types who might say, "Why, that Merlin is spectacular." Instead, they argued and swore at each other, always in a good-natured way over bird songs. Their phonetic interpretations were creative. Instead of such standards as Old Sam Peabody for the white-throated sparrow or Drink Your Tea for a towhee, they made up their own, like for the white-eyed vireo, whose song, they say, is clearly Dick Vermeil shit. And they noted that the American redstart often ends its song with an emphatic, "Oh, fuck it." Once, when a broad-winged hawk soared past, they all looked up through binoculars and watched it ride a thermal along a ridge. It would tack into the wind, then adjust its tail like a rudder to quickly turn the way a surfer would on a cresting wave. It seemed like a good 30 seconds went by when one of them finally said, "Now there's a bird that's really got its shit together." The rest nodded reverently. My beautiful outhouse. It really did look lovely there, hidden in the woods. Its deep forest green exterior blended perfectly with the surroundings. My wife generally steers clear of the outhouse, but did provide me with various accoutrements to make an outhouse an out-home. A vintage metal shelf from a barber shop holds toilet paper and hand sanitizer, and a wire rack of magazines serves as the library. The Current Farmer's Almanac, a National Lampoon from 1973, an Alaska Sportsman from 1954, and a small book of classic fishing quotes. A pair of binoculars hangs from a hook in case something of note flies by or perches. An old porcelain sign is screwed to the door outside that says, "Gents, but please know that all are welcome, regardless of gender." The 100 Years Mouse War. Mice. In the woods, they are admittedly adorable, with their long whiskers, big ears, and funny long tails. And ecologically speaking, they are a crucial cog in a well-functioning forest. Hawks and owls scarf them down by the talonful like a bowl of furry popcorn. Ditto for foxes, weasels, bobcats, and other rodent-loving predators. When they are not being eaten themselves, mice in turn eat pest insects and disperse seeds in their comings and goings. Yep, mice are so darned important. But when they enter my cabin, they become one thing: a disgusting, pooping, peeing, gnawing, scratching, disease-carrying scourge with a bullseye between their beady little eyes. I wasn't always this ruthless. The last of the woodsmen. Tim makes his own maple syrup, something I've helped him with a few times over the years. If you've never watched 40 gallons of water boil into one, let's just say it's not an activity for the impatient. But I can't think of a nicer way to spend a day or two outdoors in late February or early March, when, for the first time, you can feel winter ease its grip on the land. There's hope in the sunlight. It gives off tangible warmth, and the light of day lingers just a little longer. Sometimes there's still a foot of snow on the ground. Other times, just a few patches of corn snow remain in the shady leaves of trees and rocks. Fishing Journal, June 22nd. A barred owl calls from upriver. The first stars have appeared. Behind me, Jupiter lays low and bright. I make another cast, and again can't see where the fly lands. It's either darker than I think, or my middle-aged eyes are, well, acting their age. Probably a little of both. The trout rises again. I lift it tentatively and am immediately rewarded with ponderous head shakes, followed by a burst of drag from my reel that pierces the silence of the river. Of all the types of trout fishing I do, this may be the most satisfying. It is nothing short of hitting a home run blindfolded. Last one. Anyone who has taken a biology class remembers that mutation is a key part of evolution. You know, drop a tail here, grow an extra toe there. Sometimes it works out for the best. Darwin's finches come to mind. Other times it doesn't, like the story I just read on the internet about a turtle born with 2 heads on a reptile farm in China. So has it worked out for me, an angler who bought a cabin to fish and only fish, but wound up hopelessly intertwined in something much larger than merely fishing? Have I become a graceful finch with a highly specialized bill, or a 2-headed turtle lumbering aimlessly in circles? I leave that up to you to decide. Thank you. Questions?
I'm not sure if you said it, but when was the 700-year flood?
I didn't. It was in 2006. Yeah, so in 25, whatever. Wait for the next one.
Yeah.
Kate?
So upstream from your property, were there other property holders upstream there, or did it go right into that meadow that you referred to?
There are other property owners upstream. And that's probably where the trout came from, because the upper reaches of the stream were not as badly impacted. From my property all the way down to the mouth was completely trashed. I don't think there were any trout there. So I think slowly some fingerlings or something happened where the trout recolonized, and the mayflies and all the other things.
So actually my follow-up question
Oh,
is,
yeah.
to what degree did you start to work with your neighbors on either end of your some of the
My upstream neighbor owns half a mile of stream, and I found out the Fish and Wildlife Service had a granting program where they would install stream structures in a stream if it was like a wild trout stream. And I met with a guy, and he was like, well, your stretch is too small, but if you get your upstream neighbor, we'd be interested. So I was like, oh, great. And so I wrote this proposal, and I knew the guy. He owned like a rod and gun shop in town. He is no longer with us. He's a very nice guy. And local guy, and I went up to him and I sent him this proposal and letter and the whole thing. I met with him, and he was like, I don't want the federal government on my property. No. And then plus, and this is when I first found out about it, he goes, plus they're going to be drilling for natural gas all over the place. And that was the first time, and I was like, what? Anyway, John Delaney.
Since you purchased the cabin, have you noticed a difference or a change in the animal and plant communities around the cabin, be it amphibians or birds or what have you?
I see fewer wood frogs, for whatever reason. Totally anecdotal. I used to see a whole ton of wood frogs. I don't anymore. The trout numbers over the past couple of years have been lower, and this year was the anomaly, but the past several years were dry. And when the stream is dry, it's a tiny stream. It is 6 feet wide. That's what I call it in the book, the 6 foot wide stream. And when it gets very low, I think things like herons and kingfishers and mergansers and mink and all those other things have at it, and the trout numbers are down. They've been down for the past couple of years. I'm hoping this fall, the brook trout spawn in the fall. I'm hoping the high water this fall might have been good conditions for the trout to spawn. But they're as low as they get. Every year I see fingerlings. So they do successfully spawn. I mean, they're not going to wink. Like I said, they've been around for 14,000 years. So, Eric.
So Stephen, I don't want to sound too critical, but in the book, how do you sort of reconcile the fact that you're driving 125 miles to your cabin, and then you're seeing these intense storms that have a relationship to the fracking that people want to do. I mean, there's a circle here.
Who says I drive? No, I'm kidding. No, Eric, you're absolutely right. And I think everyone goes through that, you know. Everyone who, I mean, we all use fossil fuels one way or another. But yeah, that's true. I don't know how to rectify that. I mean, I have a Honda Fit that gets 38 miles to the gallon. That's the car I drive, and maybe someday I'll own a Tesla with the sales from this book. But yeah, it's thanks, man. Chrissy.
How was writing your second book versus your first one?
It was more of a challenge because I had a real deadline. The other book I wrote for fun, and then after I was done with it, I was like, oh, let me try to get this published. This was like, okay, sign here, 60,000 words in 6 months. See ya. And it was tough because, like, I sort of write all day here, and then I'd come home and have to write some more. And I was just telling this story to someone. I would make sure I wrote every day, and I'd sort of lock myself in my little writing chamber. And sometimes I'd come out 3 hours later and tell my wife, I'd go, I wrote 100 words. It was not a lot. And but I did, and then other times I come out and I go, I wrote 1,000. It was great. So one thing that was really fun was I took some time off and went up to the cabin and wrote. And that was cool because if ever I want to know, like, well, what is that pool like in the stream? And how does that trout? I'd be like, let's find out. And I'd go out and I'd catch a trout and I'd go, oh, man, now I know. And I'd write. But that was fun. So it was harder in some ways because you had a real deadline. In some ways it was lots of fun.
Where's Finn in all of this? Is he sharing your passion?
All right. I'm not here just to buy my book, all right? However, there is a genuine ghost story in this book starring my son. It is probably the creepiest real-life ghost story I've ever been part of, and I don't believe in ghosts.
And it is.
So Finn is part of it from, we bought the cabin 2 years before Finn came along, and there's also a whole chapter of walking in the stream with Finn and how he's grown up doing that. Now he's 13. He can catch a frog better than any kid I know. Steve?
There's something we discussed after I read the book, and it flows from the wet walk.
Yeah.
And you said you had thought about that as well, about not only the environment changes and, Finn's love for that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah. So when I wrote it, I realized at the time that, I write this chapter about going on stream walks with Finn, and when I wrote it, he was 11, right? And I didn't realize that I was capturing this moment in time that's kind of the door shutting. Now we're up there, he's 13. I'm like, hey, Finn, let's go for a stream walk, catch some crayfish. And he's like, yeah, you go, Dad. The funny thing is, like, I'm still like, yeah, let him go. So hopefully he'll get, the fact is, he's 13. He's all into this Fortnite game, good Lord. And he doesn't think going up to the cabin on weekends is as cool as it used to be. The problem with him is I do, and I'm the one,
You drive.
Yeah, I drive back and forth. Any other questions? Yes, Nat.
How are the trees doing?
Oh, man, thank you for that question. It is really, how the tree's doing. It is really interesting to see, and I do write about this. I didn't know anything about trees. I mean, I did take a class in college, and I completely forgot all of it, except, like you scratch a birch tree and it smells like root beer. That's kind of cool. But it's very cool to see trees you planted. Now some of them are 20 feet tall. And it is really interesting to see how the same species of tree in certain locations just kind of languish. They're just like, I need sun. And others are like, we're doing great. And the one tree that friends who are really into trees go like, oh, that's not a real tree. One of the trees that they sell is a hybrid poplar. And this thing is unbelievable. All you just put it in the ground, give it some sun. I mean, you can almost watch it. It's almost like, you know? I mean, this thing is like, I mean, I planted in 2007, right? The season after the flood. It's got to be 40 feet tall now. I planted a whole bunch of them. And there's this whole forest that I planted that forest, and it was, 10 years ago, which is pretty amazing. So, and then other trees, it all depends. Some of them I planted, some species I planted, never to be seen again. I don't know what happened. I guess the deer browsed them, or they just were like, we don't like it here. Yeah. You find out what trees like it and what don't. And then the other interesting thing is like the trees that came back on their own, like the volunteer seedlings, which I had nothing to do with. One day I remember after the flood looking on the ground, like, what are all those little green sprouts? And it was birch trees, like thousands of them, just something seeded, and everything was, conditions were perfect, and man, they went. And now those birch trees are 10, 12 feet tall. It's a thicket of them. So birch trees are not designed to grow this far apart. So they are at this point. Something's in store for those trees. I mean, I don't know what it is, but some competition or whatever will weed them out, or thin them out, so to speak. Anything else? Outhouse questions? Yeah. All right, thanks. I'm going to sign some books. Those who want it.